Winnifred Calder kept her mother's loom-house alive on the creek flat below the town, and the respectable side of the little valley had decided her cloth was a cheap, reworked rag wool passed off as new, and that any decent household would send its wool elsewhere, when the truth was that she was only keeping the one honest trade her mother had left her, and had never yet woven a yard that. Cheated a living soul. She did not know yet that before a rigged tack sail could take the water-powered mill her dead mother had built and hand the creek to a rich man who had long wanted it. A near-silent man who ran the country's survey lines and had scarcely said 100 words to her would set his own name against the whole valley to save her. It had begun, the way the hard turns of a life so often do, with a thing she did not choose. Her mother, Mercy Calder, had built the loom house board by board and diverted the creek to turn the fulling mill with her own hands, and had raised Winnie in the smell of raw fleece and dye steam and creek-damp wool, teaching her to card and spin and set a die and warp the great barn loom until she could weave a coverlet that held its color and its warmth against a hard winter better than any. Bolt off the railhead. Then a lung fever took her in 2 short weeks, and because she could work the wool and the loom as well as any weaver in the territory, Winnie went on keeping the wool works, the one trade her hands knew, in a valley that had lately found it had no place for her. And the respectable side of the town. The side with the painted storefronts and the new church and the wool factor's wife at the head of it, looked at a young unmarried woman keeping a mill alone and tending her own dye fires at all hours, and decided, well before her mourning was decently done, exactly what that made her. The word went round the way such words always do, low and certain and impossible to answer, and it had help. For a man who wanted what she stood on had seen to it that the word had teeth. Here is the thing the town had not troubled to learn. Winnie was 26, raised at her mother's elbow by a woman who had no sons and taught her everything she knew because the work wanted doing, and she had never had the least gift for being ornamental. She kept one thing of her mother's above all the good wheels and dye kettles, a small worn cherrywood shuttle carved with a running vine. The first tool her mother had ever cut for the great loom, the shuttle she had thrown across the warp for 30 years so that every good coverlet and blanket carried her hand. She kept it on the loom beam and threw it through every yard she wove. And the smooth-worn wood of it in her palm was the one thing in that whole cold, lonely year that still felt like mercy and like home. And none of it would matter, because a rich man's hunger for her creek and her water-powered mill meant to finish what the gossip had started. The wool works lived or died by the fulling mill and the creek. The fine cloth fulled and finished true only in the cold, clean water her mother had diverted to the wheel, and the whole trade sat on the one good creek flat below town. But the biggest wool commission factor in the country, who bought and shipped the valley's whole clip east, had lately set his eye on that mill seat for a great scouring works of his own, and when Winnie would not sell, she knew. The way anyone who had watched such men knew that a factor who meant to have a thing did not give it up, and that the good watered flat she stood on was exactly the thing such a man decided he had better own another way. I have been keeping this hearth a long while now, telling the slow stories, the ones where nobody is rescued by luck, but only by the stubborn daily choosing to do the next right thing with whatever hard season you have been handed. And if that is the kind of story that keeps you good company of an evening, then pull your chair up close and stay with me. Because Winnie is about to learn the thing this whole channel keeps circling back to, that the people a town is quickest to whisper about are so often the very ones with the least to be ashamed of, and that it sometimes takes one silent, unlikely soul to see a person plain when the whole valley has made up its mind not to. The factor was a broad, prosperous man named Harlan Beck, who handled the most wool in the country and had a reasonable, regretful way of speaking, and did not come to Winnie with threats but with an offer. He rode down to the flat himself, hat in hand, and told her in his slow, easy voice that it grieved him, that Mercy had been a fine woman, but a mill wanted capital a lone weaver could not raise. And the creek could serve a proper scouring works that would bring wages to the whole valley. He would buy the flat off her at a fair price and take the worry off her hands, and perhaps it was for the best, a mill seat and a dye yard being no fit place for a young woman to keep late hours alone. He let that last part sit gently in the air, the way such men do, and wished her good day. And Winnie stood among her mother's dye kettles with the cold going all the way through her, for she had nowhere to go and no wish on earth to sell the ground her mother was buried above. The teeth in the town's talk had a name, and the name was Marcus Doyle. 2 years back, before her mother took sick, Marcus had come through as a traveling man buying wool and hides along the line, and had courted Winnie honestly enough for one summer and spoken of a settled life, then moved on down the road without a word. But he had come back that spring, hired now as Harlenbeck's wool-buying agent, and finding Winnie alone and easy to step on, he had smoothed his own history and served his new master both at once by letting it be understood, in the worried way of a man protecting an honest buyer, that the Calder cloth was cheap reworked shoddy, rag wool torn back to fiber and rewoven and sold as new, and that a decent household would not lay such a cheat on its beds. It was a lie built to cost him nothing and her everything, and it spread through the valley like a grass fire. For a town that would not buy a fallen woman's cheating cloth would hardly grieve to see her cheating mill sold off for taxes. The silent soul who would see her plain through all of it was a widowed civil surveyor named Nathan Frey, the closest-mouthed man ever to set up on that range. He ran the survey lines and set the section corners and drew the plats up and down the country. Slow, careful work that suited a man who could stand a whole day alone over a chain and transit and not mind it. He had come west running lines for the land office and the railroad, and had earned a good fee land patent of his own for 5 long years of it. He had lost his wife to a fever their first hard season out, and had not married again, and had got so far out of the habit of company that folk took his silence for sourness. But Nathan Frey had eyes, and what they had been telling him across 2 years of running chain past her creek was that the young woman the valley had decided to scorn was the finest hand with wool and dye and loom the territory had, who had carried the mill alone through her mourning and the whispering, without once letting the town see her flinch. And he understood 2 things the whole valley would not say aloud, that Harlenbeck did not care a straw whether her cloth was honest but wanted her water and a cleared flat and a name to hang a cheap purchase on, and would take both the moment the mill was sold, and that Marcus Doyle's shoddy talk was a plain-built lie the town had swallowed because it was easier than being fair to a lone woman. If you've made it this far into Winnifred Calder's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. He came to her at the end of a long day, when the light had gone off the water and she was carrying a wet-finished coverlet up from the mill, the creek talking soft over its stones below the flat. He took off his hat and turned it in his big, careful hands, and said the longest thing he had said to anyone in years. He knew it was not his place, but he had seen how Beck had set his eye on the creek and heard what Doyle was saying, and it was not right. A thing she had not done costing her the mill and the good name she had kept clean. And there was one way to slow them, if she could stand it. A landholding married householder had standing before the tax board and the assessor that a lone woman keeping a mill did not, and a man's name beside hers was far harder for a factor to buy off or shout down, and the moment she was a respectable, married woman, Doyle's whole ugly whisper had nothing left to stand on. If she would let him marry her, plain and quiet, he could buy her the time the valley meant to deny her, and the talk would lose its teeth. He would sleep in his own camp up at his transit and ask nothing she did not freely give. She would keep her loom-house, her mill, and her own self entire. He made the whole speech to the brim of his hat, for he could not have made it any other way. Winnie did not answer that night. She lay awake over the cold loom-house and turned it over, for a marriage on paper to a near stranger was a hard, strange bargain. But she understood what he had truly offered, which was not himself, but her own good name and livelihood handed back to her, the very things the factor and the liar had set out to take. And he had offered it without once making her feel small, as a plain matter of what was right and not of charity. In the morning she went out and lit the dye fires and set the warp on the great loom and found the work still hers, and when Nathan came by she told him, steady, that she would take his name and be grateful, and the corner of his mouth moved, which on him was very nearly a smile. They were married 4 days later by the town circuit preacher in the little parlor of Clemency and Otis Pruitt, who kept the general store on the road above and stood as witnesses. There was no ring and no kiss, because that was not what this was. Nathan said the words low, looking at his own hands, and Winnie said hers, looking at the window where the last of the light came down over the flat. That evening Winnie slept over her own cold loom-house, a married woman, and Nathan slept in the camp by his transit, a married man, the little cherrywood shuttle dry on its beam, and neither of them yet knew what they had begun. The hard turn of that summer was the slow making of them. There was nowhere much to be but at the work, his transit and her loom. And though Nathan kept faithfully to his own camp, a paper marriage has a way of leaking into the daylight whether two people will it or not. He re-timbered the mill race when the old sluice rotted, set new bearings on the wheel so it ran smooth and true through the driest weeks, mended the leaking loom-house roof, and rehung the fulling mill door so it sealed at last. All without being asked, and mostly without a word, and she saw all of it, saw that the silent man did for her in the only language he had, and began, without quite deciding to do for him in return. She kept a plate warm on the stove for whatever hour he came down off his lines, mended the coat he wore to the meeting-house, and learned the sound of his chain and hammer the way you learn a clock. And the talk between them, between two people who had married to stop the town's talk, came slow and then easier, the way a cold room warms when the fire is lit. She found he was not silent because he had nothing to say, but because he had spent years with no one worth saying it to. And if she did not press him, the words came low, dry, and once in a while very nearly funny. He told her a little at a time about the wife he had lost on the trail and the home place he had meant to raise for her and never had, and Winnie did not try to fix any of it, only let him set it down where another soul could see it. And she found herself telling him things she had told no one, and the loom-house had stopped being a place she merely endured. They both felt the change and were half afraid of it, for a thing built to buy a little time has no business taking root. It was the survey that opened the way through, and old Otis Pruitt who let the last of it slip. The assessor's talk of a tax sale grew louder by the week, the improvement assessment on the mill set so high no honest weaver could ever pay it, and Winnie braced herself to lose the works her mother had raised board by board, and then one gray morning she went to the mill and found a fresh set of surveyor's stakes run all down the creek flat, new laths driven true along every line of the ground. Plainly the labor of many quiet nights, and by them a corrected plat left rolled on the sill, the flat and the mill seat and the water drawn out plain and exact. It remeasured the whole flat so that no assessor could honestly say what he had said. And she knew whose hands. She had half heard him more than once in the small hours, a chain rattling and a maul driving stakes along the dark line, and had told herself it was only the wind on the mill. She said nothing to Nathan of the survey. But the next morning, careful, she asked Otis Pruitt whether Nathan still meant to file on his own fee land come the fall, the patent he had crossed the whole country to earn, and the old storeman, not knowing he was telling her anything, said no, that it beat him, that Nathan had signed the patent over to another man that very spring and put the money God knew where, and that a man did not run lines 5 years to earn a piece of ground and then hand it off for no reason. Winnie stood a long moment in the bright doorway after Otis had gone back into the store, and something began to come clear that she was almost afraid to look at. That afternoon she went quietly to the county courthouse in town and asked to see the tax entries on the creek flat below her mill. And there it was in the book, the delinquent tax certificate on the mill and the adjoining creek water parcel the factor meant to have had both been quietly bought up that spring by a private party and redeemed and paid current so no tax sale could touch them, and the private party who had signed away a hard-earned fee land patent to pay for it and ask nothing was Nathan Frey. She walked back down to the flat with her ears ringing and understood the whole of it at last. The quiet man had not merely lent her his name. He had taken the fee land that was the whole reason he had crossed the country and signed it away to buy up the tax certificate and the creek parcel, so the flat could never be sold from under her and her water could never be seized, and had rerun the whole survey through the dark besides, and had done all of it silently, so she would never see it or feel she owed him. Winnie, who had been taught too young to ask a thing of anybody, felt something she had shut away since the cold weeks her mother died come loose in her chest. That evening when Nathan came down off his lines, she took the first coverlet off the loom, thrown through with her mother's shuttle, and laid a warm fold of it into his hands, and let her fingers rest against his a moment longer than she ever had, and did not draw them back, and he looked down at her hands, and then up at her face, and did not say one word, and everything was said. But the shoddy talk was still abroad, and Winnie found she was not content to let it stand. Nathan had bought her the flat and the water while letting the town go on believing Marcus Doyle's lie, and that she would not have. The mill could be saved with a clear title, but her name could not, and her name she meant to win back herself with the one trade that was truly hers. So she sent to the territorial capital to have the county tax board sit and hear the assessment in the open, and she went back through her mother's careful records and her own until she had what she needed, and sent word up and down the valley that when the board came, she would answer the charge against her cloth and her mill in the open, before anyone who cared to come. For here was the thing Marcus Doyle had forgotten. Her mother had been a careful, honest weaver, and every fleece she ever bought and every coverlet she ever sold she had put down in a book, plain and dated, and Winnie had kept it up after her. Between her mother's dye book and loom record, her own dated ledger of sales, the dated receipts for every clip of new territorial wool she had ever bought off the valley's own growers, and Nathan's corrected plat. She had the whole truth of it in black and white, and the truth did not favor the man who had lied. The morning came, and half the valley gathered on the flat below the mill to see the cheat woman answer for herself, with Marcus Doyle come along in his good coat and Harlan Beck on his fine horse at the back to watch the finish. And they found they had walked into the wrong morning. Winnie stood by her dye yard with her finished coverlets ranged on a scrubbed rail before her, and she did not make a speech. She stood aside while the county tax board and a wool grader from the capital drew a thread from every piece and pronounced each one clean new clipped wool, not 1 yard of reworked shoddy among them. Then she opened her mother's dye book and loom record on the rail and let the men who could read come and read the dates for themselves, and laid the dated fleece receipts beside them, the proof that every pound of her wool had been bought new off the valley's own growers and never once been rag, and that not one soul the talk had named had ever bought a yard from her. And then, plain and quiet, she laid down Nathan's corrected plat, drawn and signed, that showed the improvement assessment had been levied on a mill and a measure of ground that were never lawfully hers to be taxed for, and out of whose office the false figures had come. There was no cruel word in it. She only stood beside her own honest work and let the valley read the dates and the lines, and watch the color drain out of Marcus Doyle's face, and understand at last which of them had been telling the truth all along. And before the murmuring had died, Nathan Frey stepped up beside her and said, low but plain, that the tax certificate on the mill and the creek parcel below were hers and clear, that they had been bought and redeemed and held current months since, and no man's tax sale could lawfully touch her water or her flat, and the county clerk was sent for and confirmed every word. Harlan Beck sat his fine horse a moment with his face gone stiff, having reached for a good creek flat that was never his to take, and a scapegoat that would not hold, and then turned it and rode back up the road, and Marcus Doyle was gone off the flat before the crowd had done talking, and gone from the county not long after. There was no shouting and no triumph in it. The people simply saw in plain daylight what they had been too quick and too unfair to see before, and a good many of the respectable wives found they had somewhere else to look. The board struck the false assessment that same week, the tax rolls were set right where they belonged, and Winnie kept her mother's mill, free and clear, on the ground she loved. Nathan Frey had stood at her shoulder through the whole of it with his hat in his hands, and when it was over he did the thing he had never done, and turned to face her plainly where any who cared to could see. He did not make a speech. That was not his way. He only said, low, but not so low, that Clemency Pruitt a step away could not hear and later gladly tell it. That he had told her in the spring he would go his own road once she was safe, and that he had found he was a liar, because he had no wish to go any road that did not have her on it, and that if she would have him for true, and not for any name got up against a factor and a lie, he would count it the great good fortune of his life. And Winnie looked at the silent man who had spent his one dream on her and bought her water safe through the dark and never let her see it, and did not make him ask her twice. They were married again in the early fall, for true this time, in the little church that had lowered its voice about her only a season before, with the Pruitts and half the valley crowded into the pews, and a few of the respectable wives near the front looking a shade ashamed, as well they might. The circuit preachers said the words right at last, the clean fall light coming down through the glass, and that evening, after the last of the guests had gone, Winnie set her mother's little cherrywood shuttle on the mantel of the creek flat house Nathan had begun to raise for them. Where the low gold light came across it, the shuttle her mother had begun a life's honest work with, that had thrown good warm cloth through a whole cold, lonely year, and had earned its place at that wedding as much as anyone in the room. She had come into that hard year a weaver's heir, with a mill they meant to auction, and a name a stranger had poisoned. Certain the best of her life lay buried in the cold ground above the creek. She grew old on that flat instead, beside the quiet man who put his name beside hers when no one else would, and the good warm coverlets of that whole valley came off her loom for 40 years, thrown every one with the shuttle, and the wives who had once lowered their voices about her brought their whole households to her door. The old cherrywood shuttle sat on the mantel still by then, worn dearer than ever, beside the true survey stone Nathan had set to mark their own good ground, the old shuttle and the good square corner catching the low gold light together. A name, it turns out, is the smallest part of what a person is worth, and the cruelest thing a town can do is decide who you are before it has troubled to know you. So here is what I will leave you with tonight, friend. Before the lamp burns low, when the world has believed a lie about you and reached for the one thing you have kept alive with your own two hands. Do you let their whispering and your own pride drive you off your ground, or do you trust the right soul to see the whole of you in the hard season and stand beside you in the easy one? Tell me which one you would have chosen, and pull your chair up to the hearth again soon.